This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. If you like us, please join our community of supporters by giving to our Patreon campaign. You'll find all about it on our homepage. I am Gilad Halpern, and every week my co-host Dalia Shandlin and I talk about books and research and other things that have caught our attention. Dalia is away this week, and I'm delighted to be joined by a guest co-host, Dina Kraft. Dina is a journalist, predominantly for Haaretz and the Christian Science Monitor, and she's also a fellow podcaster. She's the host of The Branch, a podcast about Jews and Arabs. Hi, Dina, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So tell us briefly what The Branch is.
Yeah, The Branch is a podcast hosted by Hadassah, and every episode is a look into the world of two people, either a Palestinian and Israeli or an Arab citizen and a Jewish citizen in Israel, and their lives together, their connections. So, for example, the most recent podcast was about two rappers from Jaffa called The Poet and the Prophet, and they rap and they write together in Arabic and Hebrew and English and Russian and Amharic. And, we've had interviews with journalists from Gaza and from Tel Aviv who are longtime colleagues. So every time is a deep dive into their lives and their connection and their friendship.
This is highly recommended, and I, of course, recommend you all to tune into The Brunch, but not before you've listened to this episode of the Tel Aviv Review. Because our guest today is a medical anthropologist at the University of Sussex and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is the author of a new book entitled Making Bodies Kosher, The Politics of Reproduction Among Haredi Jews in England. It was recently published in English by Berghahn Books. Dr. Ben Kasstan, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thanks for having me.
So the book analyzes the reactions and relationships of the ultra-Orthodox in Manchester. You know, they are the members of a traditional and rather insular community. There's a lot to unpack here, and we will shortly. But it's the way they negotiate healthcare services. And by implication, it explores issues of bodily governance, biopolitics, or in short, the relationship between the physical body and the body politic. So my question to you by way of an introduction is, why healthcare? I mean, is it because it's state service that you cannot entirely opt out of?
I think it's a great question, and it's really the starting point of what got me into the research and fascinated about the research in 2012, 2013. They have among the highest total fertility rates in England, which basically means the kind of number of children born per family, you could say. And in just a few decades from now, they're likely going to be the majority of the Jewish population. And that's something you see this kind of discussions happening, I think, in Israel, also in the United States. So what I was really interested to learn was, if the community is growing so rapidly and the kind of demographics are going to be shifting, what then are the kind of the needs and implications around maternity and childcare? And that's touching on some very contemporary issues of vaccine hesitancies that we're seeing again in the UK, the US and Israel. And then kind of thinking about this, and as I started to do some kind of exploratory research, I saw this kind of language that public health services looked at Haredim as being hard to reach, a hard to reach group, which again, what does that really mean? And then that became the kind of, the foundation of the research of looking at healthcare as actually one of the last remaining places or borderlands where Haredi Jews and the state, an abstract concept, kind of interact and encounter and negotiate each other's positions. Because in daily life, if you're Haredi, you might go to a kind of Haredi private school, so you might not be kind of encountering the education system in the same way. You might not be integrated into the employment market as well. And obviously there are differences between men and women in those relationships. But healthcare is the kind of the one thing that you need, that you access, and these kinds of questions of halakha and bodies and care and expectations kind of meet.
Yeah, you use an interesting term. Instead of community, you choose to say social body. How did that inform your research, and why did you choose that word social body as opposed to community?
I think community is a really kind of contested term. And when we think about community, what does it mean? It's something very rosy, kind of romanticized, warm. But actually, when you kind of dig under the surface, you have all these kinds of internal conflicts, internal differences that really make us question, well, can we call it a community? And then again, when we look at kind of healthcare material, the word community is so often deployed, but who's in that community, who's involved in that image and who's not, who's excluded? So then the term social body, it's really borrowing from some kind of key anthropologists, Margaret Locke and Nancy Shepherd Hughes, who in their research, I think in 1987, the paper was published, it's talking about, the individual body, the social body as, a group, and the kind of the body political body of the nation, and how these are mutually kind of created and constructed, and what the kind of the state wants to cultivate, and what maybe kind of particular social groups or social bodies try to cultivate, and how ultimately the kind of the individual body is that ground for which these dilemmas and discussions take place.
Why did you choose to focus on Manchester? I mean, it's not even the cultural and demographic epicenter of the Haredi community in England. I mean, were you looking for, as a group that is as marginal as can be to reflect on those issues?
I think Manchester is a fascinating place. So the book is part historical. It's looking at kind of shifts in migration and shifts in the Jewish population over time. So there's often a lot of discussion, a lot of focus on London because it's really the kind of the capital of Jewish life in the UK. Manchester, for other reasons, is absolutely fascinating. It was once one of the wealthiest cities in the world because of British colonialism and the kind of industrial power that Manchester had. And you had, at the turn of the 20th century, you had kind of waves of Jewish migration from Central and Eastern Europe, bringing kind of all these dilemmas of healthcare as well, by the way. But more recently, what we're seeing is, the cost of living in London is astronomical. So if you're a Haredi family with, a large family size, how do you do it? How do you manage? So Manchester has kind of inward migration, we could say. But in terms of a place, it's really interesting because it's much more contained. So in kind of one seemingly Jewish community, shall we say, you have, Hasidish, you have Haredim, you have Orthodox, you have non-aligned Jews, all sitting side by side and in tension with each other. I remember there was a state-aided Orthodox Jewish school, so a state that receives kind of money from the state, sitting amidst a kind of Haredi and Hasidish neighborhood. Of course, those Haredi and Hasidish families wouldn't send their kids there. So then what are the dilemmas? How do you negotiate this? And what does it tell us about the construction of a so-called community?
Is there much connection between the Haredi community and the non-Haredi Jewish community in Manchester?
No. I would say usually what seems to be the case is the kind of the broader Jewish and the broader non-Jewish world are, actively avoided. And I think that's, part of a strategy of protection. So in my experience, Haredi parents wouldn't send their kids to kind of Jewish social groups from the broader community, might be very reluctant to get involved. Of course, you might have the odd one or two who do that. But generally speaking, that was not what I saw.
So just tell us how a person like you carries out an ethnography of the Haredi, well, not community, the social body in Manchester.
When you're doing this kind of research, there's a lot of kind of looking at, what's been done in the literature, what are the kind of questions that we're wanting to formulate. And then I think I really just, picked up all my things as a PhD student in Durham and moved to Manchester. And just really tried to make it work, develop those kinds of relationships, be seen kind of going around, kind of, just living your daily life in, what you could call a bit of a shtetl, and kind of going to the places where you might buy kosher food and kind of synagogues and looking at kind of the libraries and trying to identify the spaces where kind of people come, people meet, that you might be able to begin approaching and raising these conversations.
Were you welcomed in all these places?
No, definitely not. Welcome is a broad word.
How hard was it to penetrate those circles?
It took time, and this is why, ethnographic research and anthropological research does take time, because you have to, firstly, what is so important is to build these relationships of trust. And slowly, you might meet one person, and then you might meet another person. And the longer you're there and you're living your daily life, you can build those relationships.
You mentioned in the book that you're Jewish from your father's side, which, of course, Haredim don't accept, according to halakha, as being Jewish. What did they make of you? And also, you were talking to women, right? You're talking to mostly women. And how did they negotiate being with you, a young man, interviewing them, talking about fairly intimate questions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'll just backtrack a little bit, because when I was first, looking at these questions, I thought this was going to be a very different study. It was going to be about kind of child health and child vaccinations. And I thought, okay, well, that'll involve working with men and women and also, the kids themselves. As I kind of, grew and became raised as an anthropologist, I realized, well, if you want to look at child health, you first have to look at the kind of the politics of maternity and the construction of parents, and especially women. So that shift took place. Yes, my dad is Jewish and my mom is not. So that is, raises all these kinds of questions of who is a Jew and what makes somebody a Jew, which I think is hugely political and politicized here in Israel.
But also for them, I'm sure it's probably one of the first questions you were asked, right?
Exactly. Well, I mean, you could look at someone's name, Ben Kasstan or Ben Kasstan, and you could think, okay, the chances of that. And, I think what might have been complex for these relationships is that, I know quite a lot about Judaism and have a very strong Jewish identity and a kind of progressive reform sense of the word. So there were all sorts of kind of conflicts and rejections and claims of what is authoritative Jewish and what it means to be Jewish and ultimately what you are not. And I think that was, quite hard for me and also quite hard for them. I remember, there were times you were used as a Shabbos goy or called a shegitz, which is quite a tough word in Yiddish.
What does it mean?
I think at a most basic level, you could say it means non-Jewish. At a kind of more philosophical level, it probably means something more like abomination or something like that. But then, there are these potentials for crafting just what are human relationships. And I think I have some of my closest friends in the Haredi world. There's always complexity, and there's always kinds of... nothing is ever black and white, I guess, what I'm trying to say.
Were there some key people, especially among maybe the midwives or the doulas you spoke to, who became your guides into the community?
Absolutely, and so the kind of midwives and doulas who were a key part of and key inspiration for the book and the research, but also just relationships and friends that I built, and I think that this position that I occupied as knowing intimately the kind of Judaism in the Jewish world and kind of issues of law and debates like this. How can I say it? I think it was as much an opportunity as it was a challenge, because on a most basic level, I think sometimes it's safer to kind of talk to an outsider than say, Mrs. Goldberg, who lives three doors down, and who might she tell and what might she tell? I do genuinely think there was another question of whatever's going on in my life, what could possibly be worse than someone in this position, someone who's, a half-blood, someone whose father married out, and this kind of someone born from that situation. But this kind of, this position allowed me to build some beautiful relationships and see the kind of the underworld also of the Haredi community, and I remember so vividly, the Haredi mother with 6 or 7 children trying to get divorced from the husband, and the kind of, all the politics that comes with that for a woman, with no food in her house, trying to manage and trying to survive, and the ability to see that and have those conversations. So I think it definitely was an opportunity as well as a challenge.
Historical context is always important when it comes to ethnography, but I think that you seem to be particularly intent on propping up your ethnography, the contemporary, the current ethnography, with archival research. Can you expand on that?
Absolutely. I think, again, looking at this relationship between history, past and present, and early 20th century, as I said, Manchester was kind of receiving all of this Jewish immigration, raising all sorts of questions for healthcare. This is a time before the NHS and before the welfare state, when healthcare was really a kind of patchwork of voluntary and faith-based services. And kind of Haredi Jews then, in order to access healthcare, might have to go to Christian missionaries and face their kind of assimilatory agenda of conversion in order to access healthcare. Now, that's something that Haredi Jews today would never have to experience and encounter. But what we do see is that healthcare remains this one place of where all these questions of assimilation and integration and protection are really visible. The kind of dilemmas that I saw happening in the early 20th century around kind of autopsy, for example, at a time when of modernizing medicine. And I remember finding in these archival records a chief medical officer saying, but these Jewish citizens just won't go for autopsies, so how do we know what's going on? And of course, that's all these kind of questions of halakha and, the body being a gift of God and should be returned undesecrated to the earth. But then, in the ethnography, questions of, say, cesareans were coming to the foreground and kind of questions of contraception, birth control. So again, all these, what is consistent across this, 150-year period is how healthcare raises these similar dilemmas. The context, of course, has shifted. England has this national healthcare system at the moment and a fantastic welfare service. But again, these questions still continue to play. And I think for me, that was fascinating.
Your foreignness to that community is part of the disconnect, but the other part of the disconnect is the inability of the community and the establishment to have like a proper conversation between them. When you look at the community, and it's also I think, prejudice in a way to think of the Haredim as insular, as wanting to take care of their own business. I'm wondering about the other side of the equation. How does the establishment treat them in the same way as, keeping them at arm's length and, looking at them as some sort of like a monolithic, maybe like, recalcitrant sort of community? How does that work?
It's a great but difficult question. I think I remember one of my research participants saying, that there's a lack of understanding from the outside in and probably a lack of understanding from the inside out. And I think that really grabs the dilemma. I think for a kind of a healthcare system that is, it's universal, but it's mandated to kind of care for a very, very diverse population. What are the practicalities of actually doing that with finite resources in an age of austerity as well? And I think there's definitely a lack of understanding from a healthcare provider of what issues and how do we navigate those issues.
Yeah, they call it hard to reach, right?
It's hard to reach.
That's a term of the community. Alongside gypsies and Irish travellers. And
Absolutely.
I mean, are they really in the same box when it comes to the...
Well, this language of hard to reach is one, but also I think underserved is another, or protected communities is another that we see. But I think they all tend to say the same thing of kind of minority groups with particular needs and maybe particular expectations, and how do we address that?
You mentioned something really interesting in the book, this idea of culture brokers called askonim, which I had never heard of before. I mean, how did they start being employed, and do they help bridge that cultural divide that you're talking about?
In some ways, yes. I think what I have seen and what has been discussed in a lot of anthropological literature is this push to kind of go and consult rabbis for almost everything, which then creates a need for rabbis with medical and health expertise, because there are areas of healthcare that present dilemmas and questions for halakha. And if you're a Haredi Jew, that is, what you live your life in accordance. So in some ways, they do help to kind of bridge those relationships, and whether those are kind of men askonim with medical knowledge or the doulas themselves who kind of bridge this area of maternity care and these kind of enable access to services. But you could also, on the other hand, say that they reinforce the autonomy and protection of the group, and that maybe askonim or people in these positions might not put the individual at the center of that question, and might put the kind of, the cosmology or the kind of the system of law, and how do we comply with that first. So again, it's not black and white, and it's a very gray zone. If you're a healthcare service that is built on an idea of patient autonomy and patient choice and individual patient care, that also raises very, very serious challenges, right, for healthcare services.
But these cultural brokers, these askonim, is that deep in the Haredi tradition, or is it something that developed in Manchester?
It's not specific to Manchester. It's often across Haredi communities. So you can find work on askonim in all sorts of Haredi neighborhoods in the US, Canada, the UK.
And a follow-up question to Gilad. What is exactly medical racism? How is it seen or played out in the Manchester Haredim, in the healthcare system, in the past and also currently?
I think medical racism is something that you see in a lot of different contexts. If we're looking specifically at this one, there was some work, I think, by Shelley Reuter on Tay-Sachs disease and how a disease became represented as a specifically Jewish disease, and how that might have been used to reinforce political issues of, say, migration and inclusion and exclusion. that's in a kind of historical context. Now you might just see it as kinds of forms of prejudice that are enacted or that are perceived to be experienced in healthcare settings. And that, again, it could cover a spectrum of things, something that is lived in terms of issues of access to care, for example. But you might also pick that dilemma up and look at issues in the United States at the minute with a very shocking maternal mortality rate for Black American women. And that might be indicative of issues of medical racism or kind of structural racism or structural inequalities.
Do you think that all these mechanisms of negotiating healthcare are ways of facilitating to an extent their integration or assimilation, or conversely, because it necessitates some sort of contact with the outside world, in inverted commas, this is the one place where they are ultra defensive? And therefore it's, they're doubling down on their insularity, as it were.
I think what is important to say from the outset is that the ambition of, healthcare services and the ambition of the Haredim is to have a healthy population with access to healthcare with least inequalities, shall we say. So I think that is definitely the ambition of public health and the healthcare system and of the Haredim, but how you go about that goal might be quite different. So I think that is important to say from the beginning. But because it is one of this last remaining borderlands, then it does become highly protected and highly policed to make sure that kind of Haredi Jews and their bodies are cared for in a way that is, shall we say, compliant. You can't see I'm using the finger word.
Air quotes. Yeah.
Air quotes, compliant with kind of cosmology and a codex of law. So I think that is where I was seeing these kinds of interventions, shall we say, of Haredim, of particularly doulas, but also rabbis in these spaces to make sure that there was a kind of balance between healthcare and access to that care, but also what is mandated.
Yeah, I thought your writing about the doulas was especially fascinating, that they kind of have to, apropos inclusion or exclusion, the women who decide to become doulas or midwives have to go out of not the comfort zone of the community. They have to go study in a university. They have to be in the outside, interact with the outside. And you also mentioned that they work without money. So how does that work? But and are there more and more of these doulas out there?
I think firstly the question of money. The Haredi. What I saw about the Haredi world is that there is an internal economy and a different kind of economy, which has, by the way, a very different redistribution of wealth. You would not see families going without food. There would be something dropped on the doorstep or money put through the door, letterbox. Or, if you were sick, then your kids would be picked up and taken to school. There is a phenomenal level of care in the Haredi world as long as you toe the line. And if you don't, you might find yourself falling very short or foul of that. So that is how I would say what enables this culture, or these cultures of maternity care. So that was the economics. What was the other question?
Which is, for these women to decide to become doulas, it means they have to think out of the box to even go out of the home to do this.
Usually, or in general, the gender component.
Usually, I think what I saw is that these doulas had been practicing for a considerable amount of time, 10 to 15, 20 years. So we're looking at extremely experienced and knowledgeable women. Usually they had probably finished childbearing themselves. So in a way it was safer to, take on that other role and pass on that knowledge to younger mothers in the neighborhood. But they were very, very inspiring women. And I think that whenever I think of my time in the Haredi world, I will always think of them with a smile.
Why were they inspiring to you?
I think in general midwives are really, really, they have a really interesting but undervalued role in a healthcare system because they are literally kind of birthing and the hands that birth every generation. And the kind of care that they might afford to labouring, birthing women, but also to the kind of, the new child that's coming. So, and I think, looking at the NHS system at the minute where midwives and there's a lot of debate in the media of midwives feeling undervalued and kind of leaving the healthcare service. It's phenomenal to see that these doulas taking on a kind of maternity care role, trying to plug what they see as a gap in state healthcare services, whether that's because of austerity. And what often was described by these doulas was that, NHS midwives were more committed to safeguarding and the technologies of care, that actually they weren't able to just be with a woman. And that by the way, is the very meaning of the word midwife, of with woman. So that was a role that these doulas wanted to take on.
And just to follow up, another place where there's been involvement in the sort of clash between the outside and the inside world is vaccination. Can you talk about that? How big of an issue is it in the Haredi world, often in the headlines, in Israel and in the States and also in the UK? So can you sort of walk us through the story of vaccination in Manchester's Haredi world?
I think vaccinations is probably one of the overwhelming reasons Haredim are of public health interest, and I think it's probably one of the overwhelming reasons they're called a hard-to-reach group because of lower level vaccination coverage. And obviously there have been these really, really unfortunate outbreaks of particularly measles, I think, in the United States and in Brooklyn. And I think in November there was a Haredi girl in Jerusalem who died from measles and was not vaccinated. I think vaccinations was one of the most interesting but complicated topics. What I was really interested to unpick was these claims that, Haredim don't vaccinate because of religious beliefs or religious reasons, and that very often wasn't the case. I think the overwhelming majority of parents I met did vaccinate, did think that vaccines were, the safest way to protect your children. They might have been selective over when they vaccinated, they might have been selective over what vaccines they gave, and selective over what kind of information they used to inform their decision-making. I think that there were a lot of anxieties around safety and a chronic lack of trust in public health services, which raises all sorts of questions about not only for the Haredim, but for the state, for the UK population at large, because these questions of trust are by no means specific.
Was it in one way or another resolved? I mean, did the two parties somehow reach some kind of agreement over that? And I'm asking because I'm trying to think whether the Haredi experience might have some implications and lessons for other populations that, treat healthcare in an unconventional way. And, anti-vaxxers, not just in the Haredi world, are becoming more and more, with a higher and higher profile. So did the Haredi experience teach the medical establishment any valuable lessons about treating anti-vaxxers, not just Haredi?
I'm not sure I'm in a position to say whether the healthcare services and public health were listening to the concerns of the Haredim. I think from my experience of working with Haredi parents, they probably felt they weren't listened to. So I'm not sure that I can answer your question.
So what do? I mean, they not just when it comes to vaccinations in general. They have their own concerns. They like to, things to go a certain way because of their tradition and their customs, and they feel that their concerns are not being listened to and not answered. How do they negotiate? I mean, you use that word negotiate quite often. How do they negotiate it?
I think what is really interesting and what I saw was kind of using to give one example, using religious sources to kind of and how those are negotiated. So you might say that it's pikuach nefesh to vaccinate, and it's the most important way to protect your child's health. Yet, on the other hand, I remember meeting a Hasidish woman who had quoted from the Gemara to say, it is worse to do something dangerous than something that is prohibited. So in other words, you would get more of, you'd be more liable or more in breach for doing something dangerous, i.e. what she saw as vaccinating, than doing something what is forbidden. So it was this, that's what I mean by negotiation, is that these texts and these positions are kind of interpreted and used in different ways.
Without reaching a bottom line necessarily.
I don't think that there is any kind of consensus on, do Haredi Jews vaccinate and do Haredi Jews not vaccinate. I don't think that there's a consensus, but there is definitely a diversity in kind of, firstly, what hesitancies parents might have, what information people use to inform their decisions. So there's definitely no consensus.
Are there Haredi rabbis or leaders who've come out and decided to do a vaccine campaign, like this is for the health of our...
There are. I didn't meet any. So I think that there's definitely more room to build in terms of relationships between public health and religious authorities. But then I did meet parents in the Haredi world who said even if a rabbi said, we have to vaccinate our children, that they still wouldn't vaccinate. So there were parents who were just so hesitant and so anxious and so opposed to vaccines that, whatever a rabbi said or whatever public health would say, they wouldn't do that. But just to add what I think was also one of the concerning things that I did see for a minority who are self-protective, who have a selective use of the internet and media, was the assimilation of kind of anti-vax material from the broader population, the broader US population.
Final question for me. I was struck by this line in your book. You say, Manchester became a continuous process of negotiating and navigation that was constantly in a state of flux and was an experience that tested my own identity and perhaps those of my interlocutors too. So we talked a little bit about this before, but now that the book is behind you, how do you feel about your Judaism now that the research and the writing is done? And how do you sort of think about your identity? How did it shift in any ways?
I think it's a really, really difficult and very personal question, and I'm not sure of the answer. There are days that you that experience made you more committed, you could say, to that is who I am. There were other days when you felt that something incredibly intrinsic to who you are was taken away from you. And all of that is, bound up with all the things that you go through as Jews, losing grandparents who for so many of us are, the kind of the Judaism that you receive, and raising these questions of how then do you move forward. But it's something that maybe I still haven't reconciled.
Yeah, and one quick follow-up to that is, as a researcher and an ethnographer and anthropologist, being an insider and an outsider, was that of help?
I think so. I think, unfortunately, you could say that there's a bias against minority researchers doing kind of research in their own minorities. So what I would hope is that the ethnography shows the very difficulties and challenges of having to do that, to address very, very contemporary dilemmas in healthcare and society.
Okay, this is all we have time for this week. Dr. Ben Kasstan, a medical anthropologist at the University of Sussex and the Hebrew University, as well as the author of Making Bodies Kosher, The Politics of Reproduction Among Haredi Jews in England. Thank you very much for coming in today.
Thanks for your time.
And thank you, Dina Kraft, our star guest co-host. Thank you.
It was great being here. Thanks.
And many thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and Itai Shalom and Georgia Foscarini, our producers, as well as the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. And now we have a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. All you have to do is launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review, and then, of course, write one, a glowing one, preferably. You can support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 500 interviews to keep you busy, entertained, and hopefully annoyed. If you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel, and you can follow me and Dalia and, of course, Dina on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.